The inheritance surprise. Barbara Campbell had just finished her morning coffee when the phone rang, shattering the peaceful quiet of her Tampa suburb home. The caller identified himself as William Hartwell, attorney for the estate of Susan Campbell Morrison. And Barbara's blood ran cold. Her younger sister Susan, dead at 64. They hadn't spoken in nearly 50 years. The morning sun streamed through her kitchen window, illuminating the same floral wallpaper that had been there since her parents' time. At 67, Barbara had grown comfortable with routine. 5 years of retirement from her position as hospital administrator had settled into a predictable rhythm of gardening, book club meetings, and occasional lunches with her few remaining friends. Her husband Frank's death 3 years ago had left her with adequate savings and a paid-off house. But dreams of European cruises and home renovations remained just that, dreams. The attorney's words seemed to float through the phone like something from another world. Susan had left her $5 million. $5 million. Barbara gripped the kitchen counter, her knuckles white against the formica surface. But there was a condition, the lawyer explained, with the measured tone of someone who had delivered stranger news. Susan had given birth to 3 children in her youth, 1979, 1981, and 1983, and surrendered them all for adoption. Barbara had known nothing of this. The inheritance would only transfer if Barbara could locate these children and obtain written letters of forgiveness from each of them, forgiving their birth mother, Susan, for abandoning them. Each child would also receive $5 million if they agreed to forgive. The total estate was $20 million. Barbara's mind reeled. Susan, pregnant 3 times? Susan, who had vanished at 18, breaking their parents' hearts and setting them on a path of worry and stress that Barbara believed had contributed to their early deaths? Their father had suffered his first heart attack just 2 years after Susan disappeared, and their mother had never recovered from the shame of having a daughter who simply evaporated into thin air. The sisters had never been close. Susan was the rebel, the wild one who challenged every rule and boundary their conservative parents had set. Barbara was the responsible daughter, the one who helped with household chores, maintained good grades, and never caused trouble. When Susan left at 18, disappearing in the middle of the night with nothing but a hastily scrawled note saying she was going to live her own life, Barbara had felt a mixture of relief and abandonment. Over the years, Susan had tried to reach out occasionally, birthday cards with no return address, postcards from exotic locations, even a few phone calls where she would try to explain herself, apologize for leaving, attempt to rebuild bridges. But Barbara had been too angry, too hurt by what Susan's abandonment had done to their parents. Each time Susan tried to reconnect, Barbara had rebuffed her. She had been the one to stay, to care for their aging parents, to watch them deteriorate under the weight of worry and disappointment. Their father died of his second heart attack at 62. Their mother followed 2 years later, her heart broken by the daughter who never came home. Barbara had been 39 when her mother died, 42 when her father followed. By then, she had met Frank, a kind but unremarkable accountant who offered stability and companionship. They married, and Barbara threw herself into her work at the hospital, rising through the ranks to become an administrator. Children always seemed like something for later, until later became too late. She had poured her maternal instincts into caring for her parents, And when they were gone, the window for her own family had somehow closed. The lawyer's voice continued, mechanical and precise. Barbara had 6 months to complete the task. All 3 children must provide written forgiveness, or the money would go to charity. He would send her the files Susan had maintained on each child. Apparently, she had been having them monitored by a private investigator for decades. The money came from Susan's marriage to Theodore Morrison, a wealthy real estate developer who had died 5 years ago, leaving Susan everything. After hanging up, Barbara sank into her father's old armchair, the one she couldn't bear to get rid of, even though it clashed with everything else in the room. $5 million. She could renovate the entire house, buy a new car, take those cruises she and Frank had always planned. She could finally live instead of merely existing on her pension, but the bitter irony wasn't lost on her. Susan, who had caused their parents so much pain, who had disappeared when responsibility called, had somehow landed on her feet with a wealthy husband and a fortune. Meanwhile, Barbara, who had sacrificed her own dreams to care for everyone else, was left with a modest pension and memories of what might have been. The files arrived by courier 2 days later. 3 thick manila envelopes, each containing a lifetime of surveillance. Barbara's hands trembled as she opened the first one. Michael Chen Morrison, born March 15, 1979. Now 45 years old, a successful cardiologist in Atlanta. The private investigator's reports painted a picture of a man who had built himself a seemingly perfect life, married to a fellow doctor, Jennifer, 2 children, a house in an exclusive suburb. But the recent reports revealed cracks in the facade. His 12-year-old son had died in a car accident 8 months ago. Michael had taken a leave of absence from his practice. His marriage was strained. The grief had consumed him, and he was struggling to find meaning in his work, in his life, in anything. Barbara studied the photographs spanning decades of Michael's life. As a child, he had been adopted by a loving Chinese-American family who had given him every opportunity. He had excelled in school, earned a scholarship to medical school, built a successful practice. He had Susan's dark hair and intense eyes, but there was something in his expression that reminded her of their father, a stubborn set to his jaw, a way of holding his shoulders that suggested he carried the weight of the world. The second file revealed Jessica Morrison Patterson, born June 8, 1981. A social worker in Denver, divorced, raising a 15-year-old daughter alone. The investigator's notes painted a more troubled picture. Jessica had grown up in a series of foster homes after her initial adoption fell through when she was 5. She had struggled with alcohol dependency. Though she maintained her professional responsibilities and had been sober for 6 months. She lived in a modest apartment, drove an aging Honda, and seemed to exist in a state of controlled chaos. Recent photos showed a woman who looked older than her 43 years, with prematurely gray hair and tired eyes that held both compassion and pain. The third file was the thickest, reflecting the intensity of Susan's attention to this particular child. Daniel Morrison, born September 12, 1983. A fire department lieutenant in Portland, married to a nurse named Maria, with a 10-year-old son born with cerebral palsy. The investigator's notes described a man driven by an almost obsessive need to save others, perhaps compensating for something he couldn't name. Daniel had been searching for his birth mother for years, hiring his own investigators, running DNA tests, following false leads. The irony wasn't lost on Barbara. He had been looking for Susan while Susan was watching him from the shadows. Daniel's story was particularly heartbreaking. He had been placed with a family that seemed perfect on paper, but the adoption had fallen through when he was 6, and his adopted father lost his job and started drinking. Daniel had bounced between foster homes, aging out of the system at 18, with nothing but determination and a fierce desire to make something of himself. He had joined the fire department, worked his way up through the ranks, married a woman who shared his passion for helping others. Their son's cerebral palsy had only strengthened their bond, and Daniel had become an advocate for disabled children while maintaining his demanding career as a first responder. Each file contained current addresses, phone numbers, workplace information, and even daily routines. Barbara felt sick reading them. Susan had been playing God with these people's lives, watching from the shadows while they lived, loved, struggled, and survived without ever knowing they were being observed. The level of detail was invasive, almost stalking in its intensity, yet it also revealed a deep, obsessive love, a mother's desperate need to know her children even from a distance. The task seemed impossible. How do you call someone and say that the mother who abandoned them 40 years ago wants forgiveness so that her sister can inherit millions? How do you explain that you didn't even know they existed until now? How do you bridge decades of silence and secrets? Barbara started with Michael. His practice's receptionist was polite but firm. Dr. Chen Morrison wasn't seeing patients or taking calls. Barbara left several messages, each one sounding more desperate than the last. She explained that she was Susan Morrison's sister, that there was a legal matter involving an inheritance, that she needed to speak with him urgently. When he finally called back 3 days later, his voice was hollow, exhausted. She explained the situation as gently as possible, but the absurdity of it all hung in the air between them. A birth mother he had never known, who had been watching him his entire life, who had died and left him money conditional on his forgiveness. Michael listened without interruption, then was quiet for a long moment before speaking. His voice was measured, professional, but Barbara could hear the underlying pain. He agreed to meet her, but only at a neutral location, a coffee shop in Atlanta where he wouldn't be recognized. Their first meeting was awkward, stilted. Michael was tall, impeccably dressed, despite his obvious grief, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He looked like a man who had been sleepwalking through life for months, going through the motions of existence without truly living. Michael was surprisingly understanding about the inheritance situation. He had long ago made peace with his adoption, he said. His adoptive parents had been wonderful, and he had lived a privileged life. The money would be nice. He could donate it to childhood cancer research in his son's memory. But what he really wanted was to understand why Susan had given him up. Barbara realized with a pang that she couldn't answer that question. She had no idea what had driven her sister to make those choices. What circumstances had led to 3 pregnancies and 3 surrenders? Michael agreed to write the letter of forgiveness relatively quickly. He seemed to genuinely understand that Susan had been young, probably frightened, likely facing impossible choices in a different era. His adoptive parents had raised him to be compassionate, to understand that people make difficult decisions for complex reasons. Barbara felt a surge of hope. 1 down, 2 to go. Jessica was harder to reach. She worked irregular hours at a community center in Denver, providing services to at-risk youth and families in crisis. When Barbara finally got through, Jessica was immediately suspicious. The conversation was tense, filled with Jessica's sharp questions about why Barbara had never tried to find them before, why she cared now, what she really wanted. Barbara found herself being brutally honest about her financial situation, about how the money would change her life, about the years of estrangement from Susan. Jessica listened with the trained ear of someone who had heard every sob story, every manipulation, every desperate plea. She had been working with troubled families for years, and she knew the difference between genuine emotion and calculated manipulation. When they met in person at a Denver coffee shop, Barbara was struck by how much Jessica resembled their mother. The same delicate bone structure, the same way of holding her head when she was thinking, the same intuitive understanding of others' pain. That there was a hardness in Jessica that their mother had never had, an armor built from years of struggle and disappointment. Jessica's story was one of resilience born from necessity. The adoption that had fallen through, the foster homes, the struggles with identity and belonging. She had put herself through college, earned her degree in social work, dedicated her life to helping others navigate the system that had failed her. Her marriage had ended when her husband couldn't handle her drinking, couldn't understand the demons she was fighting. She had been sober for 6 months, attending meetings, fighting every day to be the mother her daughter deserved. Jessica agreed to write the letter, but she was honest about her motivations. She wasn't doing it out of genuine forgiveness. She was doing it for practical reasons. $5 million would solve so many problems. Her daughter could go to any college she wanted. Jessica could get proper long-term treatment for her addiction. She could finally stop living paycheck to paycheck, stop worrying about every unexpected expense. Barbara couldn't blame her. Sometimes survival mattered more than principles. That left Daniel, and from the moment Barbara first spoke to him on the phone, she knew he would be the challenge. His voice was hard, uncompromising, filled with a lifetime of accumulated hurt and anger. He had been searching for his birth mother for years, he said. And when he found out she was dead, he had felt cheated. Now this aunt he had never heard of wanted him to forgive the woman who had abandoned him so she could inherit millions. Their first meeting was in a Portland diner near the fire station where Daniel worked. He was shorter than Michael, but broader, with calloused hands and Susan's dark eyes, burning with an intensity that made Barbara uncomfortable. He looked like a man who had spent his life fighting fires, both literal and metaphorical. Someone who had learned to face danger head on and never back down. Daniel's story was the most difficult to hear. He had been placed with a family that seemed perfect on paper, a middle-class couple who desperately wanted children. But when he was 6, his adoptive father lost his job and started drinking heavily. The family fell apart, and Daniel was returned to the system like a defective product. He had bounced between foster homes, some good, some terrible, all temporary. He had learned not to get attached, not to hope for permanence, not to trust that any family would keep him. He had aged out of the system at 18, with nothing but a fierce determination to make something of himself. He had joined the fire department, found his calling in saving others, worked his way up through the ranks. He had married Maria, a nurse who understood his dedication to helping others, who shared his passion for service. Their son's cerebral palsy had only strengthened their bond, and Daniel had become an advocate for disabled children while maintaining his demanding career as a first responder. Barbara tried to explain Susan's situation, the challenges of being a young, unmarried mother in the late 1970s and early 1980s. She talked about the stigma, the limited options, the pressure from families and society. Daniel listened, his jaw tight, his hands clenched around his coffee cup. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes searching her face. Then he spoke, his voice steady but firm. He understood that Susan had been young, that she had faced difficult choices, but understanding wasn't the same as forgiveness. She had made her decision to give him up, and he had lived with the consequences. He had survived the foster system, built a life, created a family. He didn't need her money, and he wouldn't accept it as payment for absolution. His soul wasn't for sale, he said. He wouldn't forgive Susan for money, not even $5 million. Forgiveness had to be earned, had to be genuine, had to come from the heart. Susan was beyond earning anything now, and he wasn't going to pretend to feel something he didn't, just to satisfy the terms of a will. Barbara felt her heart sink. She tried to argue, to explain how much the money would mean to all of them, but Daniel was unmoved. He had a good life, he said. He was married to a woman he loved. He had a son who meant everything to him, despite his disabilities. He had found his purpose in life, and it didn't involve accepting blood money from a woman who had abandoned him. As the weeks passed, Barbara found herself drawn into these three lives in ways she hadn't expected. Michael began calling her regularly, and she found herself becoming a confidant as he worked through his grief over his son's death. They talked about medicine, about loss, about the strange bonds that connect people who share DNA, but not history. Barbara had never been an aunt before, and she discovered she had a talent for listening, for offering comfort, for being the family member Michael needed as he rebuilt his life. Jessica was harder to reach, but no less compelling. Her phone calls usually came late at night, when she was struggling with sobriety or dealing with her teenage daughter's rebellion. Barbara found herself dispensing advice she had never had the chance to give her own children, helping Jessica navigate the treacherous waters of single motherhood while maintaining her own recovery. She learned about 12-step programs, about the daily struggle of addiction, about the strength it took to rebuild a life from the ground up. Even Daniel, despite his refusal to forgive Susan, began to warm to Barbara. He invited her to Portland to meet his family, and she found herself falling in love with his son, a bright, cheerful boy who faced his disabilities with remarkable courage. Daniel's wife, Maria, was kind and welcoming, and Barbara began to understand why Daniel was so protective of the family he had built. They had created something beautiful together, something that couldn't be bought or sold. The three siblings, who had never known each other existed, began to develop relationships of their own through Barbara's introductions. Michael helped Jessica's daughter with her college applications, offering both financial assistance and guidance. Jessica provided emotional support to Michael as he worked through his grief, understanding abandonment and loss in ways his adoptive family couldn't. Daniel became the protective older brother to both of them, offering practical advice and unwavering support. Barbara found her house, transformed from a quiet retirement home into a bustling family center. Michael began visiting Florida regularly, bringing his wife and daughter to stay with Barbara. Jessica made the trip from Denver several times, bringing her teenage daughter to meet the family she had never known existed. Even Daniel, despite his stance on the inheritance, brought his family to Florida for a week-long visit that filled Barbara's home with laughter and joy. But as the months passed, it became clear that Daniel wouldn't change his mind about the forgiveness letter. He was polite but firm every time Barbara brought up the subject. He had made his decision, and he was sticking to it. The money meant nothing to him compared to his principles, and he wouldn't compromise his integrity for any amount. The deadline approached like a freight train. Barbara had 2 letters of forgiveness. Michael's eloquent and thoughtful, Jessica's brief but legally sufficient. But without Daniel's letter, the money would go to charity, and Barbara would return to her small life of careful budgeting and modest dreams. She found herself growing frustrated with Daniel, then angry at herself for being frustrated. What right did she have to be upset with him? He was the one who had suffered, who had been abandoned and left to navigate the foster care system alone. If anyone deserved to make this choice on his own terms, it was Daniel. But the frustration was there nonetheless, a bitter taste in her mouth every time she thought about the money slipping away. $5 million. Enough to transform her life, to finally live the way she had always imagined she would when she was young and full of dreams. Enough to help Michael with his son's medical bills, to secure Jessica's daughter's education, to make a real difference in all their lives. 3 weeks before the deadline, Barbara made one last trip to Portland. She didn't call ahead, didn't ask for permission. She simply showed up at Daniel's house on a Saturday morning, finding him in his garage working on an old motorcycle with his son beside him in a wheelchair, handing him tools and chattering about school. They talked for hours that day. Barbara told Daniel about her parents, about how Susan's disappearance had broken their hearts and changed the trajectory of their lives. She told him about her own sacrifices, about the children she had never had, about the dreams she had deferred until it was too late to pursue them. She talked about Frank, about the quiet life they had built together, about the loneliness that had followed his death. Daniel listened without interruption, his expression softening as Barbara spoke. She could see him processing not just her words, but the emotion behind them, the lifetime of small disappointments and quiet sacrifices. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, his hands still on the motorcycle's engine. Then he spoke, his voice gentle but resolute. He understood her pain, he said. He understood what the money would mean to her, to all of them. But he couldn't forgive Susan for money, not even to help the aunt he had come to care about. His integrity was all he had ever truly owned, and he wouldn't compromise it now. Barbara felt tears sting her eyes, but she also felt something else, a grudging respect for this man who had grown up with nothing, but had somehow developed an unshakable moral code. She hugged him goodbye, knowing it was the last time she would ask. But as she prepared to leave Portland, Daniel's wife, Naria, pulled her aside. She had been listening to their conversation, she said, and she understood Daniel's position. But she also understood what the money would mean to the family Barbara had brought together. She asked Barbara to give her some time to talk to Daniel, to help him see that sometimes principles and practicality could coexist. The final week before the deadline passed in a blur of sleepless nights and anxious phone calls. Barbara had given up hope, had begun to accept that the money would go to charity. She had even started to make peace with the idea, thinking about how the funds would help other foster children, other families torn apart by circumstances beyond their control. Then, on the morning of the deadline, her phone rang. It was Daniel, his voice thick with emotion. He had been thinking about their conversation, about the family that had formed around Barbara's search for forgiveness. He had realized that sometimes the right thing to do wasn't the easy thing, and sometimes compromise didn't mean surrender. He would write the letter, he said, not because he genuinely forgave Susan. He wasn't ready for that yet, and might never be, but because he forgave Barbara for not knowing about them, for not being part of their lives until now. He would write the letter for the family they had all found, for the relationships that had grown from tragedy and abandonment. But there was a condition. Daniel would donate his entire $5 million inheritance to organizations that helped foster children transition to adulthood. He wouldn't keep a penny of Susan's money, but he wouldn't let his principles destroy the family that had formed around her will. Barbara wept when she heard his decision. It was perfect. She realized Daniel got to maintain his integrity while still allowing the inheritance to proceed. The money would help people who needed it, and the family would stay together. William Hartwell called that afternoon to confirm that all 3 letters had been received and were legally sufficient. The inheritance would be distributed as Susan had wished. Barbara would receive her $5 million. Michael and Jessica would receive theirs. And Daniel would receive his, only to immediately donate it to charity. The irony wasn't lost on any of them. Susan, who had abandoned her children, had inadvertently created the family she had never been able to give them. Her death had brought together siblings who had never known each other existed, had given Barbara the children she had never had created bonds that transcended blood and money. In the months that followed, the family Barbara had never expected to have grew stronger. Michael used part of his inheritance to establish a foundation in his son's memory, funding research into pediatric trauma and supporting families dealing with sudden loss. Jessica got the treatment she needed for her addiction, bought a house where her daughter could have her own room, and established a college fund that would give her child opportunities she had never had. Barbara renovated her house, but not for herself. She added bedrooms for visiting family members, created a playroom for her great-nephew, installed a ramp and accessible bathroom for when Daniel's family came to visit. She took the European cruise she had always dreamed of, but she took Jessica's daughter with her, giving the teenager her first taste of the wider world. Daniel's donation made headlines in Portland. $5 million to support foster children aging out of the system, to provide scholarships and mentorship programs, to ensure that no child would face the world alone as he had. He became a spokesperson for foster care reform, using his platform as a fire department lieutenant to advocate for better policies and more support. But more than the money, more than the programs and foundations and charitable works, what Susan's inheritance had given them was something that couldn't be measured in dollars and cents. It had given them each other. Barbara's house became the center of extended family that spanned the country. Holidays were elaborate affairs with multiple generations gathering around her dining room table. Her phone rang constantly, with calls from children and grandchildren she had never expected to have. Her spare bedrooms were always occupied by visiting family members, and her refrigerator was covered with school photos and artwork from the children who now called her Aunt Barbara. Michael found healing in his relationship with his newfound family. The grief over his son's death would never fully disappear, but it was tempered by the joy of watching his daughter develop relationships with her cousins, of seeing his wife embrace the extended family they had gained. He returned to his medical practice with renewed purpose, driven by the understanding that healing came not just from medicine, but from human connection. Jessica's recovery was supported by the family network she had never had. When she struggled with sobriety, she had people to call. When her daughter rebelled, she had aunts and uncles who understood. Her work as a social worker was enriched by her own experience of family formation, and she became an advocate for keeping siblings together in the foster care system. Daniel's son thrived in the embrace of his extended family. He had cousins who accepted his disabilities without question, aunts and uncles who celebrated his achievements, and a grandmother figure in Barbara who saw only his potential. The boy who had been born into a family touched by tragedy was now surrounded by love that transcended blood and circumstance. One evening, exactly 1 year after the inheritance had been distributed, Barbara sat in her garden watching her great-nephew play with his cousins. The house behind her was full of family. Michael and his wife preparing dinner, Jessica helping her daughter with homework, Daniel and Maria reading bedtime stories to the younger children. Susan's portrait sat on the mantel inside, placed there by mutual agreement of all the family members. They had decided that despite everything, despite the abandonment and the secrets and the pain, Susan deserved to be remembered as the woman who had inadvertently given them all the greatest gift of all, each other. Barbara thought about the letter Daniel had finally written, the one that had saved the inheritance and preserved the family. He had written it not to Susan, but to the idea of forgiveness itself. He had written about understanding without approving, about moving forward without forgetting, about choosing love over resentment, even when love was complicated and painful. The money had been important, Barbara realized, but not for the reasons she had originally thought. It hadn't been about the cruises or the renovations or the security. It had been about the catalyst, the force that had brought them all together, the shared experience that had created bonds where none had existed before. As she sat in her garden that evening, surrounded by the laughter of children and the comfortable conversation of adults who had chosen to become family, Barbara reflected on the strange journey that had brought her to this moment. She had lost a sister she had never truly known, but she had gained children, grandchildren, a legacy that would continue long after she was gone. The inheritance had been more than money. It had been the gift of family, the blessing of connection, the miracle of love that could grow even from the soil of abandonment and regret. Susan had given them all something precious, something that couldn't be bought or sold or left in a will. She had given them each other. And in the end, that was the only inheritance that truly mattered. Barbara smiled as she watched her great-nephew take his first tentative steps with his new walker. Surrounded by cousins who cheered his progress, the boy who had been born with challenges that might have defined him was instead surrounded by a family that saw only his possibilities. The children who had been abandoned had found each other, and the woman who had never had children had become the heart of a family that spanned generations. The roses in Barbara's garden bloomed brighter than ever before, nourished by the love that filled the house behind her. And somewhere, she liked to think, Susan was watching over the family she had never been able to create in life, but had somehow managed to bring together in death. The inheritance surprise had been more than anyone could have imagined. It had been the surprise of love, the surprise of forgiveness, the surprise of family found in the most unexpected places. And it was a surprise that would continue to unfold with each new generation, each new relationship, each new choice to love despite the pain of the past. In the end, Susan's greatest gift hadn't been the money she had left behind. It had been the family she had brought together, the bonds she had created, the love she had made possible. And that inheritance would last forever.